Okay, so here we are, day 2 of Camus, the myth of Sisyphus. Last time I guess we didn't get that far. I want to say we got to like maybe 6 or 7 pages in. We did at least get this notion of the absurd out on the table. So if you don't quite remember, or you forgot, or maybe you just didn't follow it completely last time, don't worry, because we're gonna be covering this again. In fact, this is a theme that kind of runs throughout the essay, really. But let me find the place where we left off. And actually, I'm gonna start on page 8, I think. Yeah, page 8. We did not get that far. This part about the body, I don't think. We ended on page 6. I guess on page 6 is where we get the clearest definition of absurdity. Not super clear, but it's the clearest you're probably going to get in the essay. I have it underlined in my version. This is on page 6, pretty close to the top, maybe a third of the way down. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. So we mentioned the notion of world, which I claim Camus is borrowing from Heidegger. There's this rift between man, between the human being and the world that they inhabit. Typically this happens when things go wrong, right? In moments of depression, in moments of failure. But it can also happen in moments of success. We get what we want and it wasn't quite what we expected. And so there's this sort of feeling of, Heidegger calls it homelessness. We are not at home in the world, and everything loses its value and meaning, and we're sort of detached from everything. So I gave the example last time of getting your heart broken. If you ever had your heart broken, and how you become sort of nihilistic. You just don't care about anything, and just the world is there. The world is there, and it kind of remains, but you no longer care about it anymore. And people try to comfort you. It doesn't really work. So that feeling, that moment, is this confrontation is what he calls the absurd. And remember, what is the main theme of the essay according to him at the beginning? What's he tackling here? Suicide. And so I suppose that in these moments of absurdity, this is when that question comes to the forefront. What is it all for? Why should I even go on living at all? Right? Is life worth living? Can I give it a meaning? Otherwise, might as well kill myself. And so Camus wants to answer this. And one way we try to answer this is through hope. So he's going to give us a little bit of an analysis of hope. All I think he under-delivers and over-promises on this. He doesn't say much about hope. And what does he ultimately say? I realize this essay is not completely easy to follow. But what does he say about hope? Is that the way that the absurd man should encounter an absurdity, is through just hoping in something blindly? Is that what he advocates for? What do you think? You had to guess. No. And in fact, I have not read this essay in years. It's probably been at least 3 or 4 years, maybe longer. And now that I've reread it, I read the whole thing this weekend again, kind of like regretting. I'm just like thinking, I think this essay is rather dangerous, to be honest with you, and I don't know if I should be teaching it. I'm afraid that I'll have some poor student in here with a bad case of depression that might read this essay and be like, holy. And honestly, I think that, I almost got angry at the essay because I'm just like, geez, this guy. It's easier said than done, because he seems to be saying, look, you're gonna kind of embrace this absurdity, right? You're gonna kind of live with this absurdity. I talked about Heidegger last class, and I think that I don't want to accuse Camus of this, but this kind of comes off like a bad reading of Heidegger. And I don't know if he means to do this, or if he disagrees with Heidegger and he's got his sort of own take on this. But a lot of this notion of absurdity, he's getting a lot of this from Heidegger's philosophy. Heidegger talks about the nothing. Camus brings this up too in the essay. The word nothing does pop up from time to time. And it's very confusing if you don't know Heidegger, because grammatically it's weird. He talks about nothing like it's a thing. For Heidegger, he doesn't talk about the absurd, he talks about nothing, this feeling of nothingness. Das Nicht, the nothing annihilates. So for Heidegger, when there's this divorce between the human being and its world, this is, when things fall apart, when my life falls apart and my dreams are broken or my heart is broken or whatever it is, and I'm detached from that world, this is when things have no meaning. It's just nothing is, really. Nothing has any significance. In fact, this kind of ties into the next book we're reading because the title, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, I think that's kind of, he's thinking of Heidegger here. Maybe he's not thinking of Heidegger in that title, but Heidegger is a good way of explaining it. Unbearable, if something's unbearable, it's usually heavy, right? The unbearable lightness, it's unbearably light. The unbearable lightness of being, well, things have being, things have meaning and significance because we give a shit, because we care. That's pretty light. The moment we don't give a shit, the moment we don't care, then nothing matters. So it's this sort of like unbearable lightness of being. Things are at one moment our dreams can be shattered, and then all of a sudden we're divorced from the world that we were once sort of immersed in. When things are going well and things are working for us, we just go about our day. Oh, it's great. Why question anything? Why question life? But when things fall apart, right? This is when that question is asked. And here's where I think either Camus is misreading Heidegger, or he's kind of taking Heidegger's theme and going his own way with it. But either way, I think, to be fair to Camus, this is the way a lot of people misread Heidegger. They see Heidegger as like, okay, well, once this happens, once you're devastated by the nothing, then you face up to your death. And this is a theme Camus will bring up later in the essay. Yes, you face up to your own mortality. I'm going to die. What am I going to do, right? My life is this one life. And there's this resoluteness that Heidegger describes. You take life by the reins and you live with this sort of resoluteness. Now, some Heideggerians, some people that read Heidegger, scholars who study Heidegger, they argue that this sort of resoluteness, this conscious, I know that nothing matters. I know at the bottom nothing really matters, but I still care anyway because it matters to me. That resoluteness is not something you could maintain permanently. There's a similar argument in Buddhism. Some of the Zen Buddhists say that enlightenment is a permanent state. Others say it's a temporary state. That when you're a Buddhist monk, or you achieve Zen, you're always Zen. You're always Zen. You're always like completely aware, right? You're always completely in tune with the absurdity of existence or whatever, but yet you're able to sort of float through it and sort of be above it all. But then there's others Zen who are like, no, like you have to go back to your practical existence and like you get lost in your activities. You fall in line with what Heidegger calls the they, or he uses the German phrase das Man, the one, what one does, what they say. And again, some people read Heidegger saying, well, once you face your death, once you face the nothing, you never go back to the they. You're now a nonconformist, and like every moment of your life, you're a rebel, rebelling against existence. I don't think that's what Heidegger's saying, and I'm kind of similar debate in Zen Buddhism. I don't think, again, enlightenment is not something, it's not a permanent state you can always be in. If that were the case, like, how would you ever get shit done? You know what I mean? You're constantly like, nothing really matters, but I'm gonna, can you really maintain it? I mean, in a way, I don't think you can, but Camus is saying that's what we should do. That seems to be his moral of the story. And I think, again, it's hard for me to he's not clear about this because he doesn't really use Heidegger. He doesn't talk about him much. He'll mention his name from time to time, and he's really under the surface, but it seems like he's either misreading Heidegger or he's disagreeing, right? The idea that one can be in this permanent state of awareness. I mean, to me, this is a very contemplative state, and most of the time, like it would almost take effort to be in this state, and that's why I think even like in the realm of the Buddhists, it's even harder to understand because, if it takes some effort to maintain this state, then that kind of defeats the purpose, because it's supposed to be a sort of letting go. It's supposed to be sort of like not being attached. So I don't know. I think that, well, maybe I should just keep going here, because I'm kind of just tearing into him before I even let him have his say, right? But like I read this thing this weekend and I was like, my goodness, this is just a hopeless essay, and it's sort of an essay of like only people that could really follow it are like these people like him who led a charming life. He was handsome, he was famous, he was pretty well off. Like, yeah, you can go have fun and be a playboy and, you know, like, great. Like, but what about somebody like the guy he mentions earlier in the essay whose daughter died, you know? Like, what are you gonna tell that guy? Just enjoy life, you know? Have as much fun as you can, right? Like, don't try to find meaning. That's stupid, you know? It's like, that might work for some people, and that might be like a really healthy approach to life. I think that might be for some people, but for some, this is where Viktor Frankl comes in. Unfortunately, we're not gonna have time to get deep into Viktor Frankl, but you know, he lived through World War II, he survived the death camps, and he wrote a book called Man's Quest for Meaning. And his critique of Camus would be something like this. You know, Frankl, he's a psychiatrist, not just sort of existentialist, but he came up with logotherapy is what he's known for. This is Viktor Frankl. And for him, you know, logotherapy is centered around the idea that everybody needs a logos. That's a Greek word that means a lot of things, but in this context, it refers to meaning or purpose. And so, you know, Frankl uses a quote from Nietzsche, something like, we can put up with any how as long as we have our why. And so, you know, we can come up with like, how does this work? How is this, you know, how is the things are? We can sort of accept any sort of condition as long as we have a reason for it, a purpose. And, you know, Frankl talks about one of his patients who lost his wife, and he was stricken with grief, and he didn't know how to go on living. And Frankl said, well, what would happen if you would have died first? How do you think your wife would have felt? And the patient says, wow, she would have been devastated too. And he says, well, now you're the one that has to suffer that. So maybe that's your meaning, right? Is that you're letting her off the hook. She doesn't have to suffer losing you. You have to suffer losing her. And so he said that his patient was able to go on living, you know, like, okay, well, at least I know that she didn't have to go through the grief that I'm going through. And so in a way, that's kind of a consolation for my grief, something like this. Frankl himself said that the one thing that let him survive the death camps was he didn't know what happened to his wife. He wanted to know what happened to her, and he was able to get reunited with her. And also he came up with this logotherapy. He's like, I got this idea, I think it's great, and I'm gonna write a book about it and come up with this new therapy. So for Frankl, that was the one deciding factor of the people in the death camp, whether they would survive or not. He thought that some of them were actually physically healthier and they died faster because they lost hope and they lost the sort of reason for being, you know. And again, I don't want to jump, I'm being too harsh on him without giving him his day in court. But it's like, it seems like he's saying, freaking screw hope, right? You're an idiot if you're trying to hope for stuff. Try to live a life without any hope. Just enjoy, and he calls this an ethics of quantity. I don't know if anybody got that far in the essay, but why does he mention this thing about quantity? Why is this an ethics of quantity? What is quantity?
The amount.
Yeah, so this is sort of, I want as much out of life as I can get. So like once I realize life is absurd and nothing really matters, well, let's just have as much as we can, right? Like once I realize it doesn't matter like what flavor I pick, I want to try all flavors. Right? Oh, 31 flavors, you have to pick one. No, I don't. I want to sample every one of them and annoy the cashier behind the counter, right? Or whatever, right? So that's sort of his advice is like get as much out of life as you can, and don't worry too much about finding some unifying meaning behind or some overarching purpose. That kind of fits in with the Vonnegut, I guess, right? Remember Vonnegut was against trying to find that unifying narrative, that you're gonna, you know, if you try to find these grand meanings of things, you're gonna fall flat against the wall. But if you just look to of course Vonnegut said, you know, love people, find relations between people, but this guy Camus just like, hey, just have fun, enjoy, get as much out of existence as you can. But we skipped this, or we didn't get this far last time. This is you might call this a side note, but I think it's pretty important because it comes up from time to time. He does mention the body, and he talks about like, well, as much as we try to act like we act as if we have this control over our destiny in the sense, well, not our destiny, our psychology. We think we have control over our psychology, that we can kind of color the world the way we see it. We can even sort of will ourselves into absurdity. In fact, now that I think about it, maybe he's kind of shooting himself in the foot with this assertion. But he says that the body itself is something that can't really be ignored as much as we try to. It has its own sort of draw. He says, in man, this is at the top of page 8, in man's attachment to life, there is something stronger than all the ills in the world. So, even when you're having the most depressing day of your life, I don't know, maybe some people aren't this way, but even when I was just, I remember losing my father, like that's probably the most depressing I've ever been. And I still ate. In fact, I ate really bad. I really let myself go. I was eating junk food and greasy crap. It was I don't know, self-torture or something like that. I was just what does it matter? Just give me that greasy cheeseburger, extra bacon, but I still I guess the first night I found out, I didn't eat for at least almost a whole day. I had to sit there. I was just but then eventually my stomach's eat, freaking eat. The body calls. The body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation. We get in the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking. In that race which daily hastens us toward death, the body maintains its irreparable lead. And skipping forward, eluding is the invariable game. The typical act of eluding, the fatal evasion that constitutes the third theme of this essay, is hope. All right, so for him, hope is just a form of illusion. We're sort of tricking ourselves. It's a way of masking this absurd condition that we're in. Hope of another life one must deserve, or trickery of those who live not for life itself, but for some great idea that will transcend it, refine it, give it a meaning, and betray it. So we've got, again, hope for another life, that we have to work for, right? I guess this is more of a religious sort of approach, or just finding some ideal to live for here and now, some political movement or something like that, some social cause that we tie ourselves to. Hitherto, it has not been wasted effort. People have played on words and pretended to believe that refusing to grant a meaning to life necessarily leads to declaring that life is not worth living. In truth, there is no necessary common measure between these two judgments. So this is a complete rejection of Frankl's claim, right? Frankl says that you gotta have meaning. If you don't have meaning, you can't go on living. But he says right here, no, that's not the case. Just because life is not meaningful, just because life is meaningless, doesn't mean it's not worth living. So, life is meaningless. That's not the same thing as saying that life is not worth living. And again, we're going to find out later on that it is worth living. Get as much as you can, right? You're here, might as well do something with what you got. Might as well do something. Get some quantity out of it. In truth, there's no necessary common measure between these two judgments. One merely has to refuse to be misled by the confusions, divorces, and inconsistencies previously pointed out. One must brush aside everything and go straight to the real problem. One kills oneself because life is not worth living. That is certainly a truth, yet an unfruitful one because it's just a truism. But does that insult to existence, that flat denial in which it is plunged, come from the fact that it has no meaning? Does its absurdity require one to escape it through either hope, this illusion, or just killing yourself, suicide? This is what has to be clarified, hunted down, and elucidated while brushing aside all the rest. Does the absurd dictate death? And of course, he says no, but his answer, again, to me, if I were a wealthy French dude who was like successful and just had a play done in Paris and was dating supermodels, yeah, I might be like, yeah, live it up, you know? But like, come on. This dude Frankel who lived through the death camps, you know? I guess. Again, I think, I admire his passion for life, is what they call it, joie de vivre, right? This is great, but I think it's a bit naive to think that this is something that can be applied to all of us, that we could all live this way. I'm being too hard on him, I guess. I don't know. Well, let's go to the next section here. He talks about absurd walls, is the name of the next section in part 1. How does he start? He says, like great works, deep feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying. The regularity of an impulse or a repulsion in a soul is encountered again in habits of doing or thinking. It is reproduced in consequences of which the soul itself knows nothing. Great feelings take with them their own universe, splendid or abject. They light up with their passion an exclusive world in which they recognize their climate. There is a universe of jealousy, of ambition, of selfishness, or of generosity. A universe, in other words, a metaphysic and an attitude of mind. Again, I want to say he's drawing from Heidegger here. We talked a little bit about this last week. For Heidegger, our moods, what he would call our moods, maybe you might call emotions. What is the German word that he uses? I forget, but it's sort of like the way we're comported towards the world. This has a certain way of coloring the way we see the world. And here's where I'm pretty sure that Camus and him are going to part ways. For Heidegger, these moods that sort of grab a hold of us are not anything we actually have any control over, right? If we're in a crappy mood, we can't just will ourselves out of it. We can't just say, I'm really bummed out and pissed off. I'm going to be happy right now. I'm going to start being happy. It just doesn't work that way, right? I mean, it does this. Maybe somebody can do that. Can you will yourself happy when you're really sad? Just, 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, happy now, right? You're faking it, right? You're not really happy. For Heidegger, this is the thing, we don't have moods. Moods have us in a certain sense, right? They take us over. And when these moods grab a hold of us, when we're angry or sad or happy or whatever it is, they shape the way the world appears to us. They color our world. They give it a certain shade. As Camus puts it here, there's a universe, a metaphysic, and an attitude of mind. I think I was kind of joking last time, right? When I'm sad, the desk looks sad. The lights are sad or depressing. When I'm happy, it's nice and bright or whatever. And so I think, again, Camus is just pointing out this. Later on, he says at the bottom of the page, at any street corner, the feeling of absurdity could strike any man in the face. Right? So again, like Heidegger says, these moods can come along and just hit us in the face out of nowhere. As it is, in its distressing nudity and its light without effulgence, it is elusive. But that very difficulty deserves reflection. It is probably true that a man remains forever unknown to us, and that there is in him something irreducible that escapes us. But practically, I know men and recognize them by their behavior, by the totality of their deeds, by the consequences caused in life by their presence. So he's, I guess, acknowledging here that obviously there's some sort of inner world to everyone that I have no access to, but that I can get a sort of sketch of a person's character by just watching what they do, how they act. Likewise, he says, all those irrational feelings which offer no purchase to analysis, I can define them practically, appreciate them practically, by gathering together the sum of their consequences in the domain of intelligence, by seizing and noting all their aspects, by outlining their universe. So even irrational behavior, even when people act crazy, if I know them well enough, I can kind of make sense of their craziness. It is certain that apparently, though I've seen the same actor 100 times, I shall not for that reason know him any better personally. Yet if I add up all the heroes he has personified, and if I say that I know him a little better at the 100th character counted off, this will be felt to contain an element of truth. For this apparent paradox is also an apologue. There is a moral to it. It teaches that a man defines himself by his make-believe as well as by his sincere impulses. This reminds me of a quote from Vonnegut, actually. Vonnegut, I think it's in Mother Night. He says, we have to be careful what we pretend to be because we are what we pretend to be, or something like this, you know? And in a way, Camus is saying the same thing, that, sure, if we're trying to get at some essence of what the person's character is, what is their inner soul, this is maybe not something that we can ever grasp. It's sort of a metaphysical impossibility. All we have is our own inner world. Yet, we see the characters they play. I think he's speaking in a metaphorical sense here. But this is odd because he actually gets literal if you read section 2, when he talks about the absurd man. One way to live an absurd life, to embrace the absurd, to reject hope, but also not kill yourself, is to be an actor, right? He thinks the actor is a good example of the absurd. Playing different roles, trying on different masks and things like that, both literally and figuratively. He sort of thinks that is what the sort of ethics of quantity would suggest. He also mentions Don Juan, not Don Giovanni, Don Giovanni is Don Juan. That's the Italian version. Who did we talk about last time? Don Quixote. Don Quixote's the crazy guy. Who's Don Juan? Y'all know Don Juan. Don Juan? He's the lover. He's the guy that seduces all the women. It's Don Giovanni, Don Juan. He's just Casanova. He's just the ultimate seducer, basically. And so Camus, you're going to see. Well, you're probably not going to see it because you're going to skip that part. But I'll talk about it a little bit next time. Don Juan is seen as a sort of absurd hero, right? That because I guess all he does is go and womanize people, just he never attaches to one or the other. Although in the story, I think he does meet his match with Elvira. He does fall in love with Elvira, and she makes him fall in love, and that's the end of the story, I think. Is he's no longer, he loses his mojo or whatnot. But for Camus, I guess again, we are what we pretend to be, because this is it, right? This is how am I living? How am I sort of representing myself to the world? This is a theme I think that is going to be pretty much common amongst all the existentialists, and I think that Camus doesn't do much about it here. This is maybe to me the only section where we get a glimpse of it, but there's another existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre, who talks about the look of the other. And in a way, I think that what Camus is talking about here ties in a little bit to this. Sartre talks about how when we're interacting with other people, oftentimes sometimes we don't give a crap about what people are thinking about us. I might be sitting in the park, for example, just watching people walk by, and in that sense, they're just objects for me, Sartre would say. I'm just looking at what they're wearing or how they're acting. Look, there's a guy playing with his dog, and there's some other kids playing frisbee, and so in that sense, I'm experiencing them as objects. But that's not the most essential or basic relationship that I have with other people. The more primordial relation is through the look. And it's not literally they're staring at me, but it's the feeling of being judged. It's the feeling of being stared at. This is one aspect of my being that I can't shake off. And in fact, because I care about what other people think about me, I construct a sense of identity. Sartre, and I would probably guess Camus as well, are going to say that if I never encountered another person, if I never encountered another subjectivity that was capable of looking at me, judging me, approving or disapproving of me, if there were no such other being, then I would never ever be in a position to care about my identity or worry about trying to define myself or somebody else. So this element of the other, and the other is always capital O in this this phrase, because we're talking not just about the other object, right? This eraser is an other, it's not me, but starts talking about the other consciousness. And my interactions with the other shape, as much as we want to deny this. I got in an argument once I was on a date with this young lady who said that she didn't care what anybody thought about her. And I said, yeah, you do. I was like, you care? She's like, no, I don't. She got really upset. I don't give a shit what anybody thinks about me. I was like, I know what you mean. I know what you're trying to say, but I'm just being real nitpicky. You care. I was like, you care at some level. I was like, what you mean is maybe you don't care about people's approval. Like, you don't care if they like you or dislike you, but you care what they think about you. I was like, you dyed your hair blonde. You got dressed up to go out tonight. Like, did you do that just so you could stare at the mirror and admire yourself? Oh, maybe. But like, on some level, you care. She got so angry. I was like, you're proving my point. You're getting all mad at what I'm saying. It seems like you care what I think about you, So, and even when I was like a little rebel Kurt Cobain wannabe in high school, I used to think like that. I don't care. Screw authority. I don't have to fit in. And but I had a certain sort of image that I wanted to project to the world. I was the rebel. I didn't conform. I was a part of the, my clique. We were the freaks, right? All the punk rockers and the goth kids and the grunge kids or whatever. And I would fit into that group. And I, we thought we were different, but we still had our own rules. I wouldn't want to be caught dead in a polo shirt or Tommy Hilfiger. That's preppy, that you're sellout. I was like, we still had a certain, and it was, again, we were thinking about what other people were thinking about us, kind of thing, on a certain level, right? So that's an important part of our identity. I'm skipping ahead a bit here on page 12. All great deeds and all great thoughts have a ridiculous beginning. Great works are often born in a street corner or in a restaurant's revolving doors. So it is with absurdity. The absurd world, more than others, derives its nobility from that abject birth. In certain situations, replying nothing when asked what one is thinking about may be pretense in a man. Those who are loved are well aware of this, right? You ladies probably know what he's talking about there. How many times you ask, what are you thinking about? Nothing. I always say that, nothing. I'm usually not, or I'm thinking about something that I probably didn't want to know. Nothing you want to hear. Yes. But sometimes that reply is sincere. Sometimes you really are thinking nothing. If it symbolizes that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent. Again, the absurd, or for Heidegger, the nothing. In which the chain of daily gestures is broken. In which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it. Then it is as if the first sign of absurdity. Then it is, as it were, the first sign of absurdity, right? And so these sort of roles that we play, these sort of, okay, I'm gonna be a baker, candlestick maker, teacher, whatever the heck, this role that I'm playing for the they starts to sort of recede. The set collapses, right? It happens that the stage set collapses. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day, the why arises, and everything begins in that wariness, tinged with amazement. Begins, this is important. Wariness comes at the end of the acts of a mechanical life. But at the same time, it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. It awakens consciousness and provokes what follows. What follows is the gradual return into the chain, right? What Heidegger would say, a return to the they, falling back into what one does. Or what's the other option? I lost my place, or suicide, right? I lost my, or it's the definitive awakening. At the end of the awakening comes in time the consequence, suicide or recovery, right? So we realize, like, heck, what is it all for? It's all for nothing. It only matters because I care about it. Oh my God. Or, well, better just cheer up and go back to it, right? It's one or the other, right? Those are our sort of options. Or maybe there's a middle, and that's what Camus is saying. There's a middle. Right, there's this sort of like, well, I'm gonna sort of embrace the absurd. I'm not gonna sort of like fall into the trap of like trying to find meaning in my life, but I don't want to kill myself either. So let's just have some fun, right? Like, let's just be Don Juan, or let's be an actor. Let's try different roles. Or what's the third one? The conqueror. Talks about the conqueror as well. We'll get to that next week probably, or maybe next class. So on page 14, at the top, a step lower and strangeness creeps in. Perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees at this very minute lose the illusory meaning with which we had clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. This recalls a passage from Sartre. Sartre wrote a novel called Nausea, or Nausea. And there's a scene in Nausea where the character is feeling, well, Sartre uses the term nausea. He feels nausea, what Camus calls the absurd. He's detached from his world. And he does this by looking at a tree. Right? And how does he do this? The tree is just this group, and the tree's like, I think it's like an old oak tree or something. It's like real famous. There's like a historical plaque or something. It's in the middle of this park. And he looks at the tree, and for him, it blows him away, because he's just thinking about how insignificant he is compared to the tree, right? Like, this tree's been here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet in a certain sense, for Sartre, he transcends the tree, and he transcends all these objects. The existentialist is going to say, Sartre would say, the tree, the mountain, the desk, or anything, it has no meaning in itself. It has no value in itself. It just simply is. It's not until I engage in some sort of project, what Sartre called a project. I have a goal or a sort of life project. Maybe I decide I want to grow up to be a doctor. I want to grow up to be a lawyer or something like that. Once I decide what I want to be, once I decide where my future lies, then all the things in the world, all the objects take on significance within that framework. So for instance, even this marker for Sartre has no meaning or value in itself. The value comes from the project I'm engaged in. Because I'm a professor that teaches at college on a dry erase board, it has value for me as a tool, as an instrument to use to write on the board. And I have a certain relationship to markers that you might not have, because UH is pretty good. They actually supply us with this stuff, so we can go get these from the office if we need them. But other places I teach, you gotta buy these yourself. So I know how expensive they are, and I know how you buy a pack of them, and half of them don't work, and half of them are dry, and they're freaking annoying sometimes. And so when I find one that's nice and dark, or dark enough like this, and it works really well, it's very satisfying. It's quite different than the relationship you have with this, right? Somebody who opposes Camus or the existentialists are say, this is stupid. What do you mean? It's just a marker. A marker's a marker's a marker. Yeah, in a certain sense, there's a sort of convention. We define it a certain way, but its value is determined, and how important it is determined by the person that's experiencing it as a marker. As a student, you're not seeing it as a tool, but I guess you might still have a certain relationship to it. If your professor is using one that doesn't work, or it's a really, really bright color, so you have to like squint your eyes to read the dry erase board, right? And then in that sense, it has a certain value or lack thereof. Maybe if you're a custodian who works here, has to clean these dry erase boards at the end of the week, and this is the bane of your existence. You're like, why don't we get chalk? It was so much easier, just a little water, and this stuff, you gotta use this chemicals, So again, depending on your project, the things will have different meaning. I was I was actually covering Sartre in my intro class earlier today, and I used the example of, myself. Let's just say I change my project and I don't want to teach philosophy anymore, and I want to be a chemistry professor. Okay, so I'm going to go back to school, study chemistry. So I go to the bookstore because I'm bored, and I like to go to the bookstore when I have time to kill, and I go look at all the books. So normally when I go to the bookstore, I go straight to the philosophy section. And so it's almost like automatic. It's a habit that I have. But now let's say I go back a week later and my project has changed. Now I'm not a philosophy guy. I'm into chemistry. I want to learn about chemistry. So I walk in the bookstore and maybe I go ahead and go straight to the philosophy department just out of habit. But now there's this display of books, this big stack that's been there for 30, 40 days. It was there last time I was in the store, but I never noticed it. I just walked around it because it was in the way. It was an obstacle to be ignored, to be walked around. Well, now I'm not engaged in that philosophical project. I want to be a chemist. All of a sudden, I'm not so anxious to avoid it. I look at it, and all of a sudden, it jumps out at me. It's a stack of chemistry books, right? So now I'm like, oh, the same object has completely took on a different meaning, a different shade, different significance to me because I'm engaged in a different project. And so the possibilities are endless. Sartre, he gives the example of a mountain. He talks about, if you're on vacation, the mountain might just be something to look at and admire, beautiful. If you're a mountain climber, maybe you're thinking about getting a crew and going and climbing the mountain, how much gear you need to bring. If you need to get on the other side of the mountain, it's an obstacle. So there's so many ways. Things don't have an inherent meaning in themselves. So this passage he's talking about, when I encounter these objects, just the brute, this thing just is, that's when I'm sort of detached from a project. Because again, in this book, Nausea, the character, he sees this oak tree and he's sort of like lost any sort of attachment to anything. And he sort of realizes this thing just is. It has no meaning. And it sort of, in a way, transcends me because it's going to outlive me. It's been here longer than me. I feel so insignificant in the face of it. Maybe you felt that way. I know I remember as a kid going to museums and just looking at stuff that was created thousands of years ago, and just thinking about how old the earth is, or even just studying science and how big the universe is. It just kind of makes you feel so small and insignificant. So this is, I guess, the sort of experience of nausea or the absurd that he speaks of. The primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. For a second, we cease to understand it because for centuries, we've understood it in solely the images and designs that we had attributed to it beforehand, right? The projects we were engaged in. Because henceforth, we lack the power to make use of that artifice. The world evades us because it becomes itself again, right? The tree is just a tree. It's no longer something to be climbed if I'm a kid or something like this. That stage scenery masked by habit becomes again what it is. It withdraws at a distance from us. Just as there are days when under the familiar face of a woman, we see as a stranger her we had loved months or years ago, perhaps we shall come even to desire what suddenly leaves us so alone, right? Just like the books that I ignored earlier and tried to evade, the chemistry books, now jump out at me, right? They used to be some background. What is that? Just let me get to the philosophy. Now those strike me as useful. But the time has not yet come. Just one thing, that denseness and that strangeness of the world is the absurd, right? So there's that moment before we jump back into it when everything ceases to have any sort of meaning, where Heidegger says we're confronted with the nothing. Men, too, secrete the inhuman. At certain moments of lucidity, the mechanical aspect of their gestures, their meaningless pantomime, makes silly everything that surrounds them. Yeah, that's another thing that Sartre talks about as well, is what he calls bad faith. And I guess that's what Camus is mentioning here too. A lot of times when we, Sartre makes a big deal about our freedom, right? We always have the ability to engage in a project freely, to define ourselves however we see fit. But most of us don't like that because it's uncomfortable. We don't have that responsibility on our shoulders. We want the answers just given to us. Well, what do I do to be good? Just A, B, and C? Okay, I'll do A, B, and C. I'll try, But most of us just sort of go through these gestures, mechanical gestures, as Camus puts them. For Sartre, he uses the example of the French waiter waiting on the customers, right? I mean, maybe that's kind of an outdated example. Most service today kind of sucks, I think. But like, yeah, you go to like restaurants, it's like, what do you want? You know, if you're lucky to get a server. But think about like some fancy French, waiter with his. I remember I used to work at this Italian restaurant where, I mean, your shirts had to be so starched. If the boss was there, he would like take your shirt and fold it, and like if it wouldn't stand up straight for a few seconds, he's like, that's not good. He's like, you have to be able to do origami with your freaking shirt, super crisp. But Sart is imagining this French waiter with he's got the napkin over his arm, and his back is like too straight, and he's just like, Madame, Monsieur, he's putting on an act. He's pretending to play this part of the good waiter. We all tend to do this to a certain extent because for Sart once said, we want to be an inkwell the way that an inkwell is an inkwell. And nobody knows what an inkwell is anymore, so maybe that's kind of a great example. Does anybody know what's an inkwell? What's an inkwell? Right, if you couldn't hear, like you used to have to dip your pen in ink. They didn't come with ink already in them. You get little pointy, and so all your desks in school would have a little circle in the corner you put your inkwell in, okay? Took you about maybe 15 seconds to explain that, and so now we all know what an inkwell is, we know what it does and what its purpose is. Okay, what does an inkwell have to do to fulfill its purpose? Yeah, have ink, right? Be an inkwell. It just has to sit there, right? So when Sart says we want to be an inkwell the way an inkwell is an inkwell, we don't want to be an inkwell, that'd be boring, but we want to be like that. We want to be easily defined, it has a purpose, hold ink, and what does it have to do to fulfill that purpose? Just sit there. And so it's sort of like we want that for ourselves, and that's why we're sort of led into bad faith. We're like, I'm a this or I'm a that, and I'm defined by this or that. But it's sort of a lie we tell to ourselves, says Sart. I remember, and there are more or less extreme forms of this. I think the waiter's kind of like, well, he wants a good tip, so he's going to pretend to be nicer than he really is, and maybe he comes off a little insincere, so it doesn't really work. But you have a lot of people who are really in denial. I remember I had a coworker when I was very young. I was like right out of high school, just started college. I think I was like 19 or 20. And he was my same age. He was my age. And I was dating this woman. I'd been dating her for a while. I guess we were fairly serious. And she would come in to work and he'd see her, and this guy would always give me shit about it. He's like, when are you gonna get married, Travis? Because he was my age. He had I don't think he was even married. He called this woman his wife, but they never actually got married. They had 2 kids together and they lived together. And he would always say stuff like, Travis, you're not a real man until you have kids, So he has this definition of what a real man is, right? And he's one, right? And if you really love your girl, you should get with her. You should like move in and be serious if you really love her. What a good man is, what a good boyfriend is, and that sort of thing. And then the next breath, the next sentence, he'd be like, oh man, my chick was out of town this weekend, man. I hooked up with this other girl. I'm like, that's what a good husband does? Like, he's, oh, shut up, man. Oh, come on. He didn't like to be called out on that, or he didn't like to feel the look of the other, right? But he, again, he had this sort of like vision of what was correct, and he used that to kind of judge other people, even though he himself was not even really living up to his own sort of values, right, per se, his sort of proposed values. So, these are like, as Camus puts it, mechanical gestures. A man is talking on the telephone behind a glass partition. You cannot hear him, but you see his incomprehensible dumb show. You wonder why he is alive. This discomfort in the face of man's own inhumanity, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, this nausea, as a writer of today calls it, right? He's talking about Sart, is also the absurd. Likewise, the stranger who at certain seconds comes to meet us in a mirror, the familiar and yet alarming brother we encounter in our own photographs, is also the absurd. right? I guess we, again, when we're in these moments, we walk past, we see people going about their day and really concerned with things, and we sort of realize, well, why? Why does it all matter? We look at our past, we look at our photographs of ourselves in the past, and we remember our old dreams and our old hopes and what we thought we'd be doing now, and we're not doing any of that, right? I thought all this stuff, well, by the time I'm 40, X, Y, and Z will be true, and none of it, right? None of it is how you expect. I come at last to death and to the attitude we have toward it. On this point, everything has been said, and it is only proper to avoid pathos. Yet one will never be sufficiently surprised that everyone lives as if no one knew. So, most of us we live our lives kind of acting as if we didn't really know we were going to die. This is because in reality, there is no experience of death. Properly speaking, nothing has been experienced but what has been lived and made conscious. Here, it is barely possible to speak of the experience of others' deaths. It is a substitute, an illusion, and it never quite convinces us. That melancholy convention cannot be persuasive. The horror comes in reality from the mathematical aspect of the event. If time frightens us, this is because it works out the problem and the solution comes afterward. So what's he saying there about death, right? Everyone acts as if no one knew. That's because in reality, there is no experience of death. Why would he say there's no experience of death?
Well, because no one knows what really happens.
Right. You don't experience death from the perspective of dying.
Yeah.
Right? You might experience others dying, but you've never died yourself. And so it's not something that you have, you might have experience of loss, you have experience of happiness, but you don't have experience of death in that direct sense. And so in a way, that's why it's easy to sort of write it off. It's like, well, yeah, it's scary, but I can kind of keep going. It doesn't weigh us down so much. It's almost like, this also, I think, he's drawing a lot from Heidegger, right? But we often hide from the fact that we are mortal. We try to, our whole life, our whole sort of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, all that he's talking about, the mechanical gestures, all that stuff is a way of sort of ignoring our mortality, of not facing up to it. Page 16, kind of closing that section up, he says, it's essential to be sure of these facts in order to be able to question oneself subsequently on the primordial question. Remember, the primordial question is life worth living. I am interested, let me repeat again, not so much in absurd discoveries, right? Actually encountering the absurd, but in their consequences. What do you do after, right? After you have this encounter of the absurd, can you maintain it? Like he says you should? Or do you have to fall back into some convention like Heidegger seems to say? If one is assured of these facts, what is to one conclude? How far is one to go to elude nothing? That's another part where the word nothing would be confusing to a reader who doesn't know Heidegger. To elude nothing, which means elude this experience of nothing. To elude this experience of things not having value. So I've got to find something else to care about, right? I got my heart broken, let me fall in love again. I lost my job, let me find another job, right? Let me go back into something. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped way ahead there. Is one to die voluntarily or to hope in spite of everything? Right? Neither, says Camus, right? No, neither. Don't die and don't hope. So what do you do, right? Well, I don't think we're gonna have time to get to that today, but we'll try. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're good on time. Okay, we still got a while. So let's jump forward a bit. This is on page 17. This is that first full paragraph, just a few lines in. He writes, whatever may be the plays on words and the acrobatics of logic, to understand is, above all, to unify. So, Camus, he's sort of equating understanding to understand is to unify. So I guess, this seems kind of like, okay, simplistic maybe, overly simplistic. But we take all the elements of experience, all of our senses, our past, present, future, projections, and we put them together in a coherent form to make sense out of them. So I suppose that's what he's saying. So to understand is to unify. The mind's deepest desire, even in its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feeling in the face of his universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity, an appetite for clarity. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal. So, and this is what he's going to refer to throughout the essay as a sort of nostalgia, man's nostalgia. What does nostalgia mean in general? It's a what?
It's like you're missing something.
Yeah, or not necessarily miss. Well, I guess it's a joy you get from things you miss, right? It's like things in the past, like when you're a kid. Like I'll watch videos on YouTube of like commercials from the 1980s. Like commercials. Like I wouldn't hate commercials, but you watch like these old like kids commercials for toys. Like I remember that toy, I remember that. But in this, he's calling it nostalgia. For him is this desire for unification. So when he uses this word throughout the essay, again, it's this tendency that we have to take the chaos of existence, the world is chaotic, it doesn't make sense, it's absurd, and to sort of put a meaning on it, to sort of put some elements together that they cohere and give us some sort of sense of meaning. Skipping to the bottom there, that nostalgia for unity, that appetite for the absolute, illustrates the essential impulse of the human drama. But the fact of that nostalgia's existence does not imply that it is immediately to be satisfied. For if, bridging the gulf that separates desire from conquest, we assert with Parmenides the reality of the one, whatever that may be, we fall into the ridiculous contradiction of a mind that asserts total unity and proves by its very assertion its own difference and the diversity it claimed to resolve. This other vicious cycle is enough to stifle our hopes. So, in a way, and this is getting very abstract, but in a way, he's drawing from a whole tradition of philosophy. And he mentions Parmenides. Parmenides was a very old philosopher. Some might say the oldest. I don't know. You probably argue Thales is older and still a philosopher. But Parmenides, like pre-Socratic, we think he lived around 700 BC, believed that everything was one. Whatever that means. Okay? So he's what you call a monist. Everything is one. The fact that we're separate from anything else is an illusion. The fact that you're different from me, or that you're separate from the chair, the table, or the air, it's all just one big thing. And I don't want to get into his philosophy. He had arguments for this. He thought that it was contradictory to speak of more than one. All sorts of contradictions would follow from this. But Camus seems to be asserting in the face of this that this search for unity, even though it is human, it's a sort of need that we have. One of the essential things about being human is that we can't unify. We're unable to unify everything. As Sartre once wrote, Sartre said that man is a useless passion. Man is a useless passion. That sounds so pessimistic, but he actually thought that's a good thing. To be useful means you're like used. Remember, Beatrice liked being used from the novel. It's good to be used, but some people don't like being used. The robot Salo didn't like it, and Rumford used it as an insult. I guess we used each other, right? But Sartre is kind of with Salo. Not to be used as a demotion. Humans are useless, but that's good. We're a useless passion. We have a passion, we want to be, we want to fulfill ourselves, but we're never fulfilled. Because we're never finished, are we? Does existence ever end? Well, it ends at death, right? But we've already talked about this theme maybe a million times before. I think it came up first when we were talking about Kierkegaard, but there is no finality to existence. You don't go to bed at night one day and say, okay, let the credits roll. All my problems were resolved. It's all over. That's not how it works. Life keeps going. So there's this urge for unity, but given our nature, an impossibility for it. our very nature is to separate ourselves from others, not in a violent way, but in a way that's just necessary. Think Simone de Beauvoir. She's another existentialist. She wrote something like, the one is primordial. You know, you have to sort of have this notion of one to see yourself as unified. But the moment that you claim to be anything, Travis, philosophy professor, citizen of Houston, human being, the moment I do that, I'm necessarily distinguishing myself from other things. When I say that I am from Houston, or I'm not from here, I live here, in San Antonio, but whatever. I'm a naturalized Houstonian. I've been here 10 years, so I guess I might as well, right? I'm distinguishing myself from what I'm not, from others. And so this is this category of being not or other is just as basic and primordial as this category of oneness. So for him, it's kind of this absurd dream to try. I'm not speaking not just of Sartre and Simone, but also Camus as well. He seems to be saying the same thing here, right? Is that we can't really resolve all differences and diversity, because if we did, we're kind of back to nothingness, right? We're back to the absurd, and then nothing really matters. Having distinctions and differences, and what Heidegger might call strife, that's the very condition for anything having any value whatsoever. At the top of 19, he writes, "Of whom and of what indeed can I say I know that? This heart within me I can feel, and I judge that it exists. This world I can touch, and I likewise judge that it exists. There ends all my knowledge, and the rest is construction. For if I try to seize this self of which I feel sure, if I try to define and to summarize it, it is nothing but water slipping through my fingers." Again, this is also very much drawn from Sartre. Sartre wrote a book called Being and Nothingness. And in this work, he basically says this about us, that we are a nothingness. We are an emptiness at the heart of existence. How do I define anything? For Sartre, everything that I define is always defined by what it isn't. The reason that I can see this desk as its own thing is because I know that it's its own thing, and it's not the air around it, it's not the floor, it's not you guys. It just is what it is, as Sartre puts it. It is what it is. But when I look for myself, and Camus is making the same point here, when I look for myself, what is that? Sartre's going to say, well, myself, it's definitely not that desk. It's definitely not all of you. It's not all the air. Sartre's going to say it's not even my body is not myself. I have the experience of being in a body, of having a body, but what the self is, it's a negation of all other things. And for him, for Sartre, the self is the only being, the for itself. This is what he calls our consciousness, the for itself. This is the only being that has a sort of relationship to the world in which it can tell when things aren't. Only humans. Maybe this is wrong. I think maybe dogs can do this, cats can do this, other mammals. But Sartre is pretty insistent that only humans are able to discern a lack of being. That we can see that something lacks, and including ourselves. Because for Sartre, whenever we engage in a project or a goal, we make ourselves a lack of being. That's kind of a funny phrase. We make ourselves a lack of being. Well, when I say I want to become a doctor or I want to become a lawyer, what am I telling myself? I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. There's a hole. There's a lack of being. There's a lack of a degree, a lack of education, a lack of the X, Y, and Z that I need to do in order to become that thing. Anybody ever go grocery shopping, make yourself a grocery list before you go to the grocery store? How do you make your list? You go to your kitchen? Yeah, how do you figure that out though? You go to your kitchen, what do you look for?
The essentials to see if you have it.
Yeah, you look for what's not there, right? What lacks being there, right? So for Sartre, we're the only ones that can do that. Like something's missing. All right, we're expecting the sugar, we're out of sugar. We want some milk, we're out of milk, right? Lack's being there. And this same lack is something that we feel at the heart of our existence. There's this sort of lack of purpose that needs to be filled, says Sartre. How do we fill it? Well, with all sorts of things, with dreams, goals, desires. Camus seems to think, don't fill it, right? Like, or just fill it for fun, kind of thing, and get as much fun as you can. What would Kierkegaard say, do you think, about this? What kind of life is this? Remember, Kierkegaard said there's different forms of life.
The aesthetic.
The aesthetic. Yeah, this is just a form of the aesthetic. And ultimately, Kierkegaard's going to say that life is going to not work because you're eventually going to be it's passionless. This is interesting because Camus seems to think this is the most passionate life. Like once you encounter the absurd and then nothing matters, like just have fun and enjoy and get as much out of life. But for Kierkegaard, it's like, well, if nothing really matters, you're not going to be that enthusiastic about it. Like if it doesn't really matter, you're just like, fun, amusing. That's not going to drive you. So that's another part of this essay that I'm just like, I don't know what he's talking about, right? Again, I think if I was Albert Camus and I was a handsome Frenchman with a lot of money and fame, I can understand this attitude. But to the apartment manager whose daughter died, and ended up throwing himself off a building, I don't know if this essay would have helped him. Probably not. But anyway, I better stop there because we're running out of time. But yeah, again, for next class, try to finish the remaining part of the first section, and we'll get through as much of it as we can on Wednesday.